Welcome to our Ambassador Interviews webzine. My name is Yvonne Kim, and I'm the Executive Director of Asia Society Korea. Today, it is my honor to interview Ambassador of Israel, His Excellency Akiva Tor. Ambassador Tor was appointed as the Ambassador of Israel to the Republic of Korea in November 2020. Before we begin, I would like to mention some of his notable accomplishments. Prior to his appointment to Korea, he started his career as a director at Israel Economic and Cultural Office in 1996. After joining Israel's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, he served as deputy spokesman and deputy director of the Department for Palestinian Affairs. He also served as World Jewish Affairs advisor to the President of Israel for about 3 years since 2003. Israel Consul General in San Francisco and Pacific Northwest, and head of Bureau for World Jewish Affairs and World Religions in MFA. We very much appreciate the ambassador's ongoing commitment, dedication, and generosity towards Asia Society Korea. So, Your Excellency, thank you for agreeing to take the time out of your busy schedule to join us today. I would like to start today's conversation about the bilateral relations. This year marks the 71st anniversary of the start of the Korean War. And while our formal diplomatic relations began in 1962, Israel has maintained relations with Korea since a decade earlier, when Israel sent $100,000 in medical and food supplies to South Korea immediately following the outbreak of the Korean War. And since then, our two countries have gone through a lot, including the closing down of our embassies following the oil crisis of 1973 and their reopening in the 1990s. Additionally, the two countries have expressed interest in strengthening bilateral ties across a wide range of domains, including defense, renewable energy, science and technology, and trade. One might say the strengthening of ties culminated earlier last month as we saw Israel and Korea sign the free trade agreement after all. So can you please start by telling us why this is an important milestone for our bilateral relations and how it will impact economic cooperations going forward?
Hello, Yvonne. It's a pleasure to speak to the Asia Society. Actually, with your permission, I'm going to go back to a few of the things that you mentioned. It's very interesting. Israel was established in May 1948. Republic of Korea, there's always this question about how exactly what year we signify. But David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, wanted to send an Israeli force from the IDF to defend the South against the northern aggression. It's interesting. He was. It's a story in Israeli diplomatic history. He was blocked by some of the parties, the left parties in the governing coalition. There was a party, Mapam, which essentially was Israeli socialist left, kind of pro-Stalin, whereas Ben-Gurion was the part of the labor movement, which was very pro-Western. In any case, he was blocked from sending troops, which, from the standpoint of an ambassador today, would have been nice if we would have participated. It could be that another element was that he was aware that Israel was going to soon be facing additional conflicts at home. After the end of the first Israel-Arab War in 1949, we had the Sinai War in 1956. And severe security crisis that entire period. So perhaps that's one of the reasons why the Israel government did not push harder to send troops. But in any case, then we had this whole story about the closing and opening of the embassies during the 70s. To my understanding, what happened was Foreign Minister Moshe Dayan decided to close the Israel embassy during the 70s in Seoul as a cost-saving measure. And then in the 90s, when we realized, the late 80s, when we realized what a mistake we made, it became difficult to get permission on the Korean side to reopen because of fear of Arab reactions. But here we are, and we have a very active embassy, and our relations between Israel and Korea are excellent. The signing of the FTA is important for a lot of reasons, but first, just to understand what it was. This is the first Korean free trade agreement signed with any Middle Eastern country, and Israel's first free trade agreement signed with any Asian country. And of course, that means also any East Asian country. So we signed with Korea before Japan, before China, before Vietnam. And I'm very happy that we were able to get it signed despite COVID at the beginning of my service as ambassador here.
Okay. And it's hard not to talk about COVID-19 situation these days. So let's get into that a little bit. And Israel has one of the highest, if not the highest, vaccination rate in the world. And many across the globe watch Israel with both envy and relief as the country pushed ahead with its speedy vaccination drive after hitting its peak in January this year. And there are reports claiming that Israel may be the first country to have reached herd immunity as the country eases restrictions as cases fall and mobility increases. And in light of recent events, things may have changed slightly. So would you please elaborate on how Israel handled things before the Delta variant? And what lessons does Israel's success story hold for the rest of the world, especially as some countries are gearing up for their vaccine rollout?
Well, first of all, I think there's a little bit of a cautionary tale here because we're feeling the Delta variant right now, and we're feeling it because young people under the age of 15 are not vaccinated, despite that the large majority of the over 15 population is. And even though right now the Israeli health authorities they're not predicting some sort of very severe outbreak, and they're not really concerned about morbidity because it's only the very young who are not vaccinated. We're still concerned, and we've reimposed masks for indoor. So we have to be very careful. In other words, we felt like we were out of the woods, but it turns out that we're not completely out of the woods. Nevertheless, I think that the situation from Israel shows that when we have a high level of vaccination, the situation is much, much more manageable. That's number one. Number two is, yes, it's true that Israel was able to achieve high levels of vaccination quickly, but we didn't have a choice. In other words, our population was not as disciplined as the Korean population. They were not listening to government guidelines for social distancing at the same level, and it caused us into 3 rounds of having to close down the economy and go into lockdown. So this was one of the reasons that the Israeli government was so proactive to get the vaccines, was that we weren't handling the social distancing as well as Korea was. We had a number of situations, however, which made us also attractive to the drug companies. We're a small population, only 9.3 million. We're geographically small, so it's possible to get Pfizer despite all of the refrigeration issues. We were able to get from landing in Ben Gurion Airport to any part of the country and deliver the vaccination within 8 hours. You can only do that in a country which is geographically limited. But another reason that the companies were interested in Israel and wanted to sign with us is because our health system is very digitized, and we have a very powerful and centralized national health service. So there's only 4 HMOs. Everyone has to be a member of one of them. And we were willing to override privacy concerns and to give the drug companies information about the efficacy of the vaccines. So Israel, for Pfizer and Moderna, we were a perfect laboratory for showing, do the vaccines work or not? And for that reason, they were happy to sign with us, and we were willing to pay above market. That's also something, the decision was made very early on by the Israel Ministry of Health and by the Israeli Treasury, that it's preferable to pay more and also to sign with a number of companies, even if one of them won't pan out, because it'll be the money that we'll lose on paying extra for the vaccines or signing a contract with a company with a pharmaceutical company which ultimately won't come up with the right vaccine will be cheaper than the cost of the drag on the economy if we have to close down again.
Okay. And we'll get into more cultural uh, issues. Both Israel and Korea place a lot of importance on memorizing the past and dreaming of a better future, memorializing the past. And we have our own unique languages and honor our traditions. Both have robust diasporas all over the world that actively represent and promote the motherland. And perhaps most importantly, both Israel and Korea have successfully rebuilt their nations from scratch around creative industries, hard work, and cutting edge technology. While South Korea's economic development, often referred to as the miracle of the Han River, has focused on industrialization coupled with the emergence of globally competitive conglomerates. And Israel has become the hub of many global high-tech companies, and according to many, the Silicon Valley of the Middle East. And how did a country of such small population develop such a vibrant entrepreneurial ecosystem? And what can South Korean business leaders and policymakers learn from the startup nation? Is there anything South Korea can replicate, or are some of these factors specific to its unique culture? What's your opinion about that?
People call Israel Silicon Wadi. So, first of all, I think that we have a lot to learn from Korea as well. I mean, Korea is a very strong brand in Israel. Israelis, we're not an expert in all of the details of Korea's modern history, but Israelis are aware of how difficult the Korean War was and how Korea truly lifted itself by the bootstraps and created this great economy. And in many ways, I think that we see the Israeli experience in the Korean experience. To be fair, Israel was in dire economic straits in the early 50s and 60s. But I don't think it was quite as harsh as the Korean situation. In other words, Israel was very poor, and it wasn't until the 80s that the Israeli economy began to take off. Mm-hmm. But I don't think we had the dire economic straits and the harsh experience of industrialization that Korea went through. But in Israel, Korea is very, very much respected for its achievements and well liked. I also feel like Israel is a strong brand here in Korea for similar reasons. So all that is good. Why is Israel such an innovation center? Well, a number of books have been written trying to explain it. I've read most of them, and they all get it partly right. Sometimes they exaggerate a little bit too much. But basically, Israel is a country without natural resources. We've recently discovered natural gas in the Mediterranean, and basically we hope it doesn't ruin everything. But like Korea, we don't have natural resources. But unlike Korea, we don't have enough land for manufacturing. Israel's too small. We can't smelt steel. We can't build cars and ships here. The country's just too little for it, and maybe the labor force is not big enough as well. But we have high regard for education, and it's something about Israel which in our culture where people sometimes think that Israel is undisciplined or is a little bit out of control. It's not true. We're quite disciplined. We're to a certain extent hierarchical, but we're not formal. And therefore, anyone can really say anything, and it's pretty much welcome. In the Israeli embassy here in Korea, for example, so I'm called ambassador by the Korean staff, but every single one of the Israeli staff, from the administrative officer, from my deputy to Israeli security, call me by my first name, and that's common to our culture. So I think that creates a situation where small organizations can come up with all kinds of ideas that everyone will be listened to. We're naturally quite creative, and it's created a situation where, I mean, the high-tech economic situation perfectly fit on the Israeli character. And for that reason, we create all these startups. And on NASDAQ, Israel is number 3 after US and China, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. It creates a great opportunity for an economic synergy with Korea, because we want more Israeli innovation inside Korean industrial platforms, technological platforms. And my job is to create a deeper economic engagement between the two economies. It's already quite good. Samsung has a very strong presence in Israel, a large research and development center. But the other conglomerates are less present in Israel. We would like it to be a lot more. That's my job.
And I'm going to move on to a slightly lighter, maybe not too light subject. You and I are both educated in the United States. I don't know about you, but my mother remained as a tiger mom the whole time. And I'm saying this because there's one thing that two countries have in common, that Israel and South Korea both care deeply about education. And it's no secret that South Koreans are infatuated with academics. Each year, Koreans reportedly spend about $17 billion on private tutoring, and 83% of the 5-year-olds receive one form of private education or another, and the pace keeps intensifying until the students are ready to take the dreaded college entrance exam, which arguably has the single most decisive impact on the job prospects. And you're just 0.2% of the world's population and 23% of all Nobel laureates. While the Korean education system isn't going to emulate its Jewish counterpart anytime soon, there is a question mark hanging over the country. So is the Jewish education system the secret that we've all been after?
Well, I think with Jewish mothers and Korean mothers, I think you're onto something. I'm sure that that's correct. But one thing that really does strike me is there's a big difference about the way we go about education in Israel and the way Koreans go about education, where we're kind of opposites. And I'm not sure that either of us is completely correct. I have a daughter who's just finishing high school, and she takes school as a suggestion. I try to explain to her that school is her job, but in Israel, we believe that the youth are supposed to be as free as possible. So education is important, and we have difficult matriculation exams, and getting into the best faculties is not easy. But I think kids are having a little bit of a happier life in Israel. Is it better? I'm not sure, but it is very different. I went through many different types of education. First of all, I was educated in the U.S. like yourself, but I also went to high school in Israel, where, by the way, I had lots of many long hours as well, but not quite like Korea. We were very mischievous and did a lot of bad things in school. But I also studied in yeshiva, which was intense Talmud study, which was the Chavruta system. In Korea, they think that everyone in Israel is studying in the Chavruta partner system. It's not really correct, but it's true that in the Talmud academies we do it, and it's a very creative and deliberative way about trying to explain text. And it's the basic underlying idea is that there generally isn't one answer. So I think the Israeli education system is less harsh than in Korea, but I don't think it's producing less good results. When I was preparing for my job here, I met with 3 Israeli Nobel laureates, all of them in chemistry, who had visited in Korea. And I tried to understand what is it about their character that turned them into Nobel laureates. It seemed to me, number one, they were all extremely intelligent, extremely curious, extremely driven. But I have to say that each one of them was mischievous. They were rule breakers. One of them told me the story about how his discovery, what he won the Nobel for, no one believed him. It took years until people understood that what he was saying about crystals was correct, but he was completely willing to buck the trend. So all three of them were very, very serious people, but they like to break rules. So that's something I'd say about the Israeli character, and maybe a Jewish character as well, that helps us make these scientific breakthroughs.
I'm going to ask you a very sensitive political question. Our both countries have also this political problem in common, internally and externally. And I'm going to first talk about the internal factor. Israel has a new government in place, which is expected to be an unprecedented alliance of both political right and left. It's unclear how long this coalition will last, and previous ones that were more ideologically coherent have fallen apart quickly. Why is Israel having such difficulties forming a government?
We're having, it's a very good question. The Israeli coalition system, which is similar to the coalition system in Britain, Germany, the Netherlands, the European model, it was working very well until a couple of years ago. In other words, it basically had two large parties in the Knesset, either the Labour Party, which was center left, and the Likud, which was center right. And then we had smaller parties, and we had religious parties and Arab parties who tacked on. And what we've seen is a bifurcation to smaller and smaller parties, which is not necessarily serving the Israeli democracy very well. In the last 2.5 years, we had 4 rounds of elections, and many Israelis felt that we were entering into a period of constitutional crisis. The reason that Israelis were not more panicked by this is, I think, the same reason that Koreans don't get panicked about political problems in Korea, is there's a feeling that the society itself is very strong. In other words, even when we were in our deepest coalition crisis, it was clear that Israel could fight a war if it had to. The army would function, the government, even if it was a government that was like an emergency government, it could handle any national security crisis Israel had, because the fundamental society is very strong. But nevertheless, a break or a fracture of the political system is very harmful. We couldn't pass a budget for close to 2 years, and that's a very serious problem for national planning. Why is it happening? I think that it's part of everything it's part of the polarization which is happening in the West, in which people are less tolerant, and it's a very serious problem, and it's going to force Israel to also consider about how our system works and whether we have to reform it. The current coalition, however, is, as an ambassador, I really shouldn't try to give predictions, but it seems like I can't say how long, whether it will be able to weather some of the more difficult issues on the right or the left. But I think it's called a coalition of change, and I think it's to a certain extent it's an attempt to be a coalition of repair. In other words, it's quite good that Israelis are seeing ministers from the nationalist right and ministers from the socialist left talking together, working together, reminding each other that we are all Zionists, that we all believe in the state of Israel, that we all want the state of Israel to be the national home of the Jewish people, which respects all its minorities, and to succeed as a state, and that the things which join us are less than the things which divide us. So it's kind of a democratic repair, and I hope the government will be very successful. A term of government in Israel is 4 years and 6 months. There have been very few Israeli governments that have lasted quite that long. We'll see what will happen.
And our last question also concerns another similarity we have, which is the security issue. Um, Regardless of our internal assessments about the Korean Peninsula, many outsiders invoke the Korea risk and view inter-Korean relations with both anxiety and concern. For example, my American friends would ask me, "Is it really safe to travel to Korea because South Koreans are always fighting North Koreans and there's sort of like nuclear issue?" And there are people out there who want to learn more about Israel, but also view the Israeli-Palestinian relations with a similar look of concern. So do you think your country will ever achieve peace with your immediate neighbors, especially with the Palestinians?
Well, first thing I'd like to say is that I think that you're right about this issue of perceptions. I was asked when I was assigned to Korea, I was asked whether I get danger pay, which is kind of absurd, you know. Right. Israel is also, I think, anyone who visits Israel, they remark about how safe it is. Of course, we go through periods of tension, but basically Israel has handled internal security quite well. And unless we're in the middle of a shooting war with Gaza, which happens every couple of years, it's pretty safe. And I think people feel very safe. Regarding the prospects for peace, well, first of all, I think there's a big difference between our situations. In other words, at the end of the day, the inter-Korean conflict is a civil war. It resulted from a civil war. In other words, the North and the South are one people. Whereas in Israel, the conflict is between national movements of different peoples. And this has a good part and it has a bad part. I mean, in a sense, it can be easier and it can be harder. Your conflict is much harder because it's a conflict between two systems where it's difficult to compromise. On the other hand, you're the same people at the end of the day speaking the same language. With us, in theory, it's just a compromise between two national movements. But on the other hand, it can be much more difficult because what happens if on the other side, they don't recognize our legitimacy at all, which is our situation vis-a-vis the government of Iran and the Palestinian leadership in Gaza under Hamas. I'm quite optimistic about the potential for peace between Israel and the Arab world. Peace is spreading. We signed many peace treaties just in the last year with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. I think that there will be more with other countries, both in North Africa and also in the Arabian Gulf. Our most important relationship is our relationship with our immediate neighbor, the Palestinian people. And we've been trying to make peace in earnest since 1993. It's proved very elusive. We've also learned to live with a lack of peace that also has to be managed correctly. I'm hopeful that ultimately we will make peace with our neighbors. I hope we will. I don't know when it'll happen. What I do feel more confident about is that, look, even when we're not making peace, we have a working relationship with the elected Palestinian leadership, which is the Palestinian Authority. And I hope that we'll be able to take it to a better place within the coming years. I hope so.
I hope so. We hope so too. And Your Excellency, that completes our interview, which is normally the formal way of welcoming and introducing our ambassador members to the Asia Society friends and members. And thank you for taking your time for us. And please remember that I told you that we'll be bothering you a lot. The next time we reach out to you, it will be on a more lighter topic, which is about food. For the summer, we are actually working on different type of recipes that includes honey as an ingredient. And we found that you guys have Rosh Hashanah honey cake, which is,
right.
we believe is one of the popular dessert desserts. So we'll be reaching out to you about that and for many other occasions. And we look forward to working more closely with your embassy. And in the meantime, we hope that you will stay safe and healthy. Thank you so much again.
Thank you very much for offering this platform. I'm really looking forward to all engagement with the Asia Society. It's really a wonderful forum for discussion, for meeting colleagues, and for learning about Korea and about the wider East Asia. On the honey issue, definitely. We also have to talk about how to save honeybees around the world, which is a problem everywhere. But you're right. Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, we eat honey, and we have many recipes.
You just gave me an idea because we are actually working on a new environment, a sustainability initiative. So I would definitely reach out to you. You're really keeping me busy, Ambassador Tor, but I look forward to working with you.
Likewise. Thank you very, very much, Yvonne. Take care.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.